This is a Parsha podcast brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study, and I'm your host, Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. Let's learn. Welcome back to the Matan Podcast, where this year we are exploring the weekly Haftorah portion. This week's episode has been sponsored by Barbara and Joel Rich in commemoration of the 13th yahrzeit of Barbara's father, Reuven ben Eliezer Yonatan. We deeply appreciate serving as a continued platform for the memory of the Rich family's loved ones. For those of you who listen weekly, sponsoring an episode can be a great way to honor a memory, a friend, and even mark a momentous occasion. For more information, contact me at podcast@matan.org.il or the Matan office. Parshat Chayei Sara opens with the monumental purchase of Ma'arat HaMachpelah, the cave of the patriarchs, from the people of Chet, which conveys both the responsibility of burying one's dead and the importance of it being on one's own soil, what the Torah calls achuzat kever. The majority of the parsha concerned itself with the search for Yitzchak's wife by the servant of Avraham, who we often think of as Eliezer. Resolved to marry his son to a woman from within the extended family, Eved Avraham goes out in search of a shidduch, and the way in which Rivka enters the family is the main topic of the parsha. The parsha ends by filling in the rest of Abraham's family life, his children with his wife Keturah. The parsha's final section recounts the children of Ishmael in what is the book of Bereshit's consistent way of exiting a character offstage once and for all. The Haftorah, read by all communities, is the first parak in Melachim Aleph, where we read about the end of David's life, sadly marked by his son Adoniyahu's rebellion and the need for David to clearly appoint one son as king, which will be Shlomo. We see the idea of timeline overlap repeated in all of our historiographical books. Those are the books from Yoshua through Melachim. The beginning of Shoftim overlaps with the end of Yoshua. The beginning of Shmuel starts with our last two Shoftim, and so forth. Here we have the beginning of the book of Melachim, sort of ends with the end of the book of Shmuel. To delve deeper into this Haftorah, I'm so happy to welcome back to the podcast Dr. Nechama Price. Hi, Dr. Nechama.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Who is the director of Yeshiva University's graduate program for Advanced Talmud and Tanakh Studies, also known as GPATS, and is a clinical assistant professor of Judaic Studies and Bible at Stern College. She is a certified Yotzat Halacha and currently serves as Yotzat Halacha for communities throughout New Jersey. Nechama lectures broadly on topics in Tanakh, Halacha, and women's religious life. Her first book, Tribal Blueprints, delves into the lives and unique traits of the 12 tribes. In her upcoming book, Villains of Genesis, she aims to reveal the depth and complexity behind some of the most infamous characters in the biblical narratives. Okay, Nechama, I'm really, really happy to have you back on for this podcast. And I'm happy to be opening up the book of Melachim with you. We've already seen a much later parak in Melachim that was the previous week's Haftorah. But the clear parallel and connection between our parsha and our Haftorah is an end-of-life story, right? And the end of life in the book of Bereshit, we have Avraham's life coming to a close and the need to find his son, a shidduch. Whereas the end-of-life scene for King David's life is a much more political scene, or so it would seem at the outset. So why don't we maybe start there by talking a little bit about maybe the parallel or connection between David and Avraham, which clearly is at least an external connecting point that the Haftorah is latching onto.
Hey, I'd love to start there. Again, thank you so much for having me. I mean, the obvious first connection is the words, right? There are parallel language in the opening of the first pasuk, I would say, of our Haftorah, Melech David Zakein Ba Bayamim, a way to describe how old he is, which is exact language that's used by Avraham in Parach Havdalah Pasuk Aleph, Avram Zakein Ba Bayamim. And this language of being extremely old and therefore leading to the end of their lives already connects them, and then you start to think about it in a big picture way. And certainly these stories are the stories of how we get to the next generation, right? So our parak is how we choose Shlomo, who's then going to continue his father's legacy and build the Beit HaMikdash. And of course, what happens in Parach Havdalah is Avraham finding a wife for Yitzchak, which his way to create a family, which will be his continuation of his father's mission as well, to create that chosen nation. So the opening makes you very excited excited, at least the first few words make you very excited, because you have this feel of this connection of these two tremendous role models that we have. Avraham, who begins the chosen nation, David, who starts the line of what should be permanent Melucha from Yehuda. And you're excited because you're seeing that next generation take over, right? That's the link of these two stories, which begins on a very exciting note, but very abruptly ends when you start reading the next few words. Because unlike by Avraham, where it's exciting, Hashem be'erach et Avram bakol, right? God blesses Avram with everything, and we're having a very positive story. David's story turns bad very quickly. He can't get warmed by clothing. His old age seems to be affecting him in a very negative way, and it turns into Avram's story as this how to continue, meaning how his son can have a new wife and children, and Avram himself, as you mentioned a few moments ago, marries Keturah and has 6 more children. David is now in this scene with a woman that he cannot even be with, right? That he's not going to have more children with, that he's not even married to, he's more intimate with. And this is a very different picture that is starting us off of David versus Avraham. It's almost like we think it's going to be this positive, beautiful story, and it turns very negative very, very quickly.
Right. I think there's a midrash that also connects the phrases of Zaken Ba-Yamim. And as you said, initially it feels very complimentary, meaning we're comparing David to Avraham Avinu, and that's very, very beautiful. But then, as you said, it turns sour. There was something that I saw, I think it was in the Haftorah book by Rav Moshe Lichtenstein, and I thought he offered an interesting frame, whereas he said that when you think about the choices, and we'll talk more about Adoniyahu in a minute, when you think of the two choices that are sort of at David's, right, what's in front of him, we have Shlomo or Adoniyahu. He presents it as follows. He says that Adoniyahu would be more continuing the very sort of alive fighter military side of David HaMelech. And that Shlomo, who we know ends up building the Beit Midrash, well, of course, he has also political identity and also military identity, really ultimately is identified as the one who builds the Mikdash. And in that sense, he's sort of more of the Yoresh Ruchani. He sort of is more of the inheritor of the spiritual identity of David. This is how he interestingly frames it. And we see in the Avram story that we're not in the time of a kingdom. That's not our story right now. And he's only looking for a Yoresh Ruchani, meaning he's only looking for the son, right, or to build a home for the son who's going to be the inheritor of this spiritual world that Avraham has been building. In that regard, David ends up making, again, according to this frame, a related choice to the one that Avram didn't even have to make, because this is his son who's already been chosen for all the reasons we saw in the previous parsha. But I think that's also an interesting frame of sort of like, here's David in the glory of his personality in this time period in Am Yisrael, when we have a monarchy that we're looking to Dafka establish before it'll also fall apart again, that we have to pick the son who's going to highlight the chosen parts of the personality of David. I thought that was an interesting way to look at it. I'm curious what you think about that.
That I like very much. And I actually want to take a step back for a minute, because I think when you look at the Haftorah, there's a number of layers. Layer number 1 is, how am I supposed to walk away from David? Layer 2 could be, how am I supposed to look at some of the smaller characters, which hopefully we'll look at today, the Yoav choice, the choice of Bathsheba or Natan getting involved in the conversation. And then ultimately at the end, it's the question of why we're choosing Shlomo over Adoniyahu. And the question of, which I think is a massive question here, is David actually making that choice, or is David manipulated into making that choice? But I agree with you that part of it is coming from the question of how in control is David when we get to this story. Are we viewing David as this much older and therefore kind of out of commission almost person? And therefore the choice that's being made is actually not even David's choice that's being made, or is it that David's fully in control? And some of that is coming from the fact that when you start this story and you're hearing David is old, David cannot be warmed. And then I'll say, if you look at Pasuk Tevav, it says it even again, V'hamelech zakein ma'od, he's so incredibly old. And the way that the story is framed framed of Bathsheba showing up and he's servicing with Avishag, like she's there in the bed with him. It's so embarrassing. And the whole way the story begins makes you really question how much of this is a choice of David. And one of the most fascinating parallels, because as you know, I love parallel stories, is that there's like this glaring parallel to Achashverosh that is coming through the opening of this story. It's actually almost scary where you have, and the language is the same, where you have, there's a servant's idea of how to solve a problem of the king, right? David is cold. Achashverosh, has murdered or sent away, banished his wife Vashti, and he is missing her. And you have the language of his Avadav or his Misharsav, Yivakshu. They are searching for a Na'ara Betula or Na'arot Betulot, right? It's a little bit of a difference there, for a virgin girl who can help, or virgin girls who can help service the king or help the king in some sort of way, which then leads to this search of the kingdom. In Malachim, it's Vayivakshu Na'ara Yafa B'chol Gvul Yisrael. We are searching for this beautiful girl throughout the entire territory of Yisrael, versus Achashverosh time, they are going B'chol Medinot Machuto, his entire kingdom, but again, searching for Na'ara Betulat of Tovat Mareh, this beautiful girl. And then, of course, they find someone, Avishag, who is described as Na'ara Yafa Adma'od, the most beautiful, and Esther, of course, Na'ara Yafat Tawar V'Tovat Mareh, also incredibly beautiful, both get taken to the king as the solution to their problem. Now, this similarity actually makes you feel this almost tremendous fall for David HaMelech, that we are taking, this king who is this most awesome king who fights all these battles and wins all these battles and is a real hero for the Jewish people. And that very last story seems to resemble in so many ways Achashverosh. And though there are differences, Achashverosh is looking for many and David just one. Avishag is clearly the language of Vayavehu. They bring her, it doesn't sound like the language of Atilakach, of force. And also we're talking about one woman versus many women. And of course, in a detail that you have to point out, right? In our case, there is no, intercourse that is taking place, as opposed to what seems to be obvious in the Achashverosh story, where they all are a pilegesh once the encounter is done. But there is this feel within the beginning of the parak, which I think relates to what you were saying before, of how in control is David at this point in time? How much is this a decision that David is making versus there is some sort of fall that has taken place when we start Malachim, which seems to present David in a very different light than he's presented in Sefer Shmuel, and a very different light than he's presented in Divrei Ha-Yamim. So to me, that's really the opening of this question, which is, why is it that we're presenting David in this way, and what are we supposed to learn from that fall?
Yeah, and I think that you brought in Bathsheba briefly before, and we'll see her later on in the episode. But by bringing Bathsheba in, you also continually get the sense that David is somehow still paying for the Bathsheba story, and we're going to sort of like wave this woman who's beautiful in front of him. And unlike the Bathsheba story, where he took her at his will and then the story ensued, in this case, he's not able to do that. Even if he would have wanted to, which it seems like he's almost too infirm to do that he can't. It seems like he's not physically capable of that. And so it's also, again, contributes to this, as you said, kind of an embarrassing situation for him, and also this setup of her and Bathsheba being in the same room when we really know little about Bathsheba since that story, and them being in the same room is something that's difficult. One more piece that I also just want to point out, just again in light of last week's Haftorah where we met the Isha Shunamit, it's also interesting, right, that Avishag is also she's from the place of Shunem, and we know that women of Shunem can be wise women, right? Meaning there are women there that have other traits about them, right? We meet a woman who seems to be of the ruling class, and she while she doesn't have children in that story, but she's able to build a loft for Elisha, and we know that woman. And just thinking about that in contrast to here, and here we have a woman of a very different type, and it just further emphasizes the idea that they're looking for a woman who's serving a very physical function, and it feels honestly. It feels debasing for her, and it feels debasing for David. So I'm just adding that piece to the question of where is David? How much is he aware of what's going on, and where is that taking us?
And I want to comment on what you just said, because I think all of us, when we read that opening pasuk or the story of Avishag, we think to Bathsheba, right? We think to the sin of Bathsheba. But what's fascinating is if you look at Rashi, who quotes two midrashic, answers to the question, that doesn't come up. There are two different approaches that are brought down, and I actually did a search of the Mefarshim trying to look who really parallels it to the Bathsheba story, and I was not able to find. But the two different approaches brought down by Rashi actually fits two very different pictures of how I view this story, which is first he quotes a Gemara in Brachot, which says that it's a punishment for him ripping of Shaul's coat, and therefore because he disrespected a coat, so too this happens here. And there's a Pirkei de Rabbi Elazar that he quotes, which is that it's actually a reaction to the story right before, which is the very end of Sefer Shmuel, when he witnesses a malach who's about to destroy Yerushalayim, and he's weakened by it. His blood like drains out of him, that he becomes incredibly weak. And I see this as two very different approaches to how we're viewing this story, which is it that this story is a crash? David, up until the end, is this really strong character, wins all his battles, is really quite remarkable. And even in that last story, he's the one who stands up and protects Yerushalayim and says, don't destroy Yerushalayim, take me, not Yerushalayim, not the people, right? Until the very end, there seems to be this very, very strong David. In Divrei Ha-Yamim, I mean, the emphasis of David standing there to protect the location of the Beit HaMikdash is just an incredible thing. And therefore, this story is just a crash from there, meaning he had to be so strong for so long that he just kind of withers out at a pretty young age, because there's just so long you can hold on to that strength. And that's the view Radak brings down, which is just he worked so hard and fought so many battles, he becomes weak at such a young age. However, the other way of looking at it, which is actually the Gemara in Brachos, which is no, there's been like this consistent down for David. There's a lot of amazing stories of David, but and I think actually, even though he puts it all the way at the Shaul story, which to me is very early, I see it much more the way that you said it, even though the Midrash doesn't go there, which is since the story of him with Bathsheba, there's been almost this like, not this sudden crash, but almost like this very slow moving downward spiral for David. He doesn't go out to battle after that. He seems to stay at home, and that's where he has his encounter with Bathsheba. Then he has one son, right? Amnon rapes Tamar, and Avshalom kill Amnon, the Avshalom rebellion, the Shimi and the Sheva ben Bichri rebellion. We have then the counting story, and then we have this story, which is the punishment to David's body itself. So it's like this, everything around him kind of is coming to is going downhill, and then all of a sudden it starts to affect his own body. So there's really two ways, I would say, to look at this parak, as this kind of crash landing of David, and it's almost, you're saddened by it. It's really, how much he can fall so quickly at the very end of his life, and therefore, bringing in the Divrei Ha-Yamim, much more happy ending, which we'll look at as we continue to look at this story, which obviously Divrei Ha-Yamim doesn't bring up this story at all, is you kind of try to balance that out with the more happier ending, or is it that we see the result of sin and things that David has done wrong, and therefore over time, even though we continue to have victories against our enemy, and we're continuing to be led to a time of peace where we could build the Beit HaMikdash, David has to suffer quite a bit, as a result of things that he's done, and by the end, we have this kind of language affecting his own body.
I think that the two ways that you're looking at the possibility of looking at the demise here of David, which, to be honest, I've never looked at it as a crash fall, meaning I've always looked at it as a slow demise from the story of Bathsheba. I think if I can just lift it for a moment to our lives, I just think that it's an important way for a moment to also frame the way we often see people growing older, right? Meaning I think that that's an important piece. You can have like an Avraham who's growing older, and then in his end of his days, he has this really important mission that through his shaliach, he's able to accomplish. And that's beautiful. I think there's something beautiful about it. And he passes away, and his two sons come, even though, they're not on the best of terms, it seems. And like, there's some sort of nice closure there for everybody. But I think that also, the way that you're describing the two ways to look at David is also just a frame of what happens to people, right? Sometimes people have some really quick end, and that could feel just like a train wreck that happens in that moment. And other times people have a long, slow decline. And I think that, interestingly, often, it's not a very fruitful debate, but people can have a debate about kind of like what's worse. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, is it painful, right, to have someone have like the long, slow decline, or is it worse if someone just leaves you suddenly? Or again, I'm using this as like kind of metaphorically. But I think that if I just want to listeners to think in terms of like where this might meet them in their life, I think this might be a question to speak about from the Haftorah, and I think that's a really, really deep way of looking at David. Now, you've already referenced the idea that there's a slightly different twist in Divrei Ha-Yamim, so I just wanted to give a very, very brief explanation that Divrei Ha-Yamim, the first book, has a very many lists, genealogical lists that are paralleling a lot of our earlier stories in Tanakh. And really, as we go deeper in the book, it largely focuses on, it gets to David in terms of the genealogy, and then it hangs out with David. It hangs out with David. It's a very David-centered book. It's a Second Temple work, when and exactly we won't get into now, but it's very important to look at in parallel with Melachim, although we know that Divrei Ha-Yamim overtly looks to be Lomed Zchut. It looks to reflect positively on David's lifetime. So it famously doesn't tell the story of Bathsheba, right? And it leaves out other details because it is clearly a book that is being written as a very big support for David. Interesting to think why in the Second Temple period that's something that's really being supported. But so I'd love to hear how Divrei Ha-Yamim presents this story somewhat differently.
Yeah, so I love Divrei Ha-Yamim. I spent all last year teaching it at GPAT. Divrei Ha-Yamim Aleph is all about David, but really the goal of Divrei Ha-Yamim Aleph is not just to celebrate David, but is actually to celebrate and get excited about the building of the Beit HaMikdash. So all the details of David that have to do with building the Beit HaMikdash is found there, and it makes sense because this book is being written at the time that they're building the second Beit HaMikdash, and they want people to get excited about it. So it's a book that really celebrates all the stories that lead to the building of the Beit HaMikdash. So the battles where we get the wealth in order to be able to build the Beit HaMikdash, David's desire to build the Beit HaMikdash, and a celebration of the transfer of power from David to Shlomo, and Shlomo, of course, who builds the Beit HaMikdash, and Divrei Ha-Yamim Bet goes through Shlomo and the rest of the kings from Yehuda only, which is obviously the other big difference between Malachim and Divrei Ha-Yamim is that we really very rarely reference the kings from Yisrael unless they overlap with the kings of Yehuda, right? We really stick to Yehuda alone. Now, in Divrei Ha-Yamim, we leave out, yes, the scandals of David, so Bathsheba is not there, and obviously Avishag is not there. The entire opening of David being cold, that's not there. The entire rebellion of Adoniyahu taking over is not there. So we're going to obviously go through different details of this story and how they're reflected in Divrei Ha-Yamim. But my first point is that the death even of David is reflected differently, or the aging of David is reflected differently in Divrei Ha-Yamim, where instead of saying he cannot get warmed, it's Vayamat b'seva tova seva yamim usher v'kavod, right? So that's in Perek Chavtet. This is the very end of Divrei Ha-Yamim Aleph, Pasuk Chavchet, where it's telling us that he dies in this, very comfortable way where he's full of wealth and honor. And it's very parallel again to the language of Avraham in Bereshis Chayei, not in Bereshis Chavdaled. Vayamat Avraham b'seva tova zakein v'saveya. Very similar languages where we see that Divrei Ha-Yamim is picking up on the parallel between David and Avraham, but picking different language to parallel the two together. Though, obviously, if you look a little closer, you always can realize that there's something else hidden behind the scene, because as we know, Avraham dies, the next pasuk it tells us, he's 175 years old, and we can tell from the psukim, especially in Shmuel about Perek Hey, that David is only 70 when he dies, as he's 30 when he becomes the king. He rules for 40 years, and therefore, clearly just the age difference between the two shows you that there's a difference between Avraham and David. But the language that's used in Divrei Ha-Yamim reflects a much happier David at his deathbed. And interestingly, if you look a few prakim before in Parachav Gimel, it's a different language that's used to describe David. David zakein usava yamim, and then of course anoint Shlomo as his next king. So it's certainly referencing this story that we're talking about him getting old and choosing Shlomo. And that language actually parallels Yitzchak, who is zakein sava yamim, and Eov, who is Zakein Usava Yamim, similar language to those, which I always thought that parallel was very interesting because there's a hint there to Eov, who of course not only, has a lot of troubles in terms of losing his wealth and his children, but he's also afflicted with shchin on his own body. So there's some sort of hidden hinting there within that language, if you parallel him to Eo, that something afflicted David's body as well. But certainly in Divrei Ha-Yamim, the idea of him aging in a negative way is not there at all. So that's something to realize, that as we will look again, as we get back to the discussion of did David know, did David choose Shlomo, of his own right, Divrei Ha-Yamim certainly reflects it was David's idea. David chooses Shlomo, and from the beginning, he declares Shlomo as king, which is very different to our Haftorah.
So I'm sure our listeners are wondering, after you get that explanation, of which one am I supposed to believe, right? Which one is true? Is Divrei Ha-Yamim just sort of like a fantasized retelling because they're trying to idealize the Mikdash and the building of the Mikdash? They're idealizing David. Which one am I supposed to go with?
Okay, so that's a really great question. It's a hard question. So if you look at the Divrei Ha-Yamim story itself, that resembles our Haftorah. So that is a number of prakim in the very end of Divrei Ha-Yamim Aleph, where David seems to make a public announcement to everyone that Shlomo is supposed to be king. And he starts off in Parachav Chet to all of his officers. He then in Parachav Tet to everyone. He speaks directly to Shlomo and gives him a whole chizuk speech, all of that's missing in Malachim, to tell him 100% you've been chosen by God and you are supposed to be the king. Not only that, in Parachav Tet, David does the anointing, as opposed to our story here in Malachim, where there seems to be, as we'll come back to, this question of did David even actually choose Shlomo? But once he finally gets up and chooses Shlomo, it sounds like he tells Tzadok and he tells Natan to go anoint him, and not that he does it himself. So the question is, are we being given two very different perspectives of the story that really do contradict each other? And therefore you might want to say Divrei Ha-Yamim is just trying to give a much more positive perspective or a positive twist on the story, since at the end David does choose Shlomo, so we're just leaving out those other details of what happened to get there. Or if you look closely at Divrei Ha-Yamim, when he's being anointed, it keeps using the language of shenit. This is the second time. And therefore it is possible to argue, as does Rashi, Radak, Malbim, and many others, that there was actually two stories where Shlomo got anointed. The first one is reflected in Malachim, when David's like, okay, Tzadok, okay, Natan, you do the anointing. And then the second one is reflected in Divrei Ha-Yamim, where there's almost like this scene of David getting out of bed, right? Because that, if you put the two together, that's what it have to be, getting his strength back, getting in front of the people once again, and announcing that Shlomo is supposed to be king, and he himself doing the second coronation. And now it's so beautifully parallel the fact that if you think about Shaul, he also had two coronations, one that was not so great and one that was amazing, because the first time was when Shmuel pulls him, calls out his name from the lottery and he's hiding, and people are not so excited about it. And the second time is after his big victory against Nachash HaAmoni, where Shmuel says, let's do this again. It's Chadesha HaMalucha. Let's renew the Malucha. And there is a second coronation, and the language of Vayisbachu Sham Zvachim Shlamim, they give korbanot, Vayismach Sham Shaul, they're happy with Shaul. That's the language that's used in Divrei Ha-Yamim to describe the coronation of Shlomo. We have the same, Vayisbachu La Shem Zvachim, in Parachav Tet of Divrei Ha-Yamim. We have B'simcha Gedolah, great happiness. So the language of Shaul's second coronation is used in the coronation of Shlomo in Divrei Ha-Yamim. So I think the easiest way to put it together, as is quoted by Rashi and Radak, is that Malachim Aleph is representing the original story when David says, oh right, it's supposed to be Shlomo. And then of course Divrei Ha-Yamim is representing what happens next. And what happens next is almost this emergence of David from that sad, pathetic state into back to the strong David that we know, who then coronates his son a second time. And I think that's a beautiful way to look at it.
Right. And I think that when we deal with these questions about Divrei Ha-Yamim versus the earlier books in Tanakh, I think that a lot of times we have to look at each story differently in terms of understanding the relationship between them. But I think it's also important to point out that while David dies in the second parak of Melachim, before he dies, he gives a lot of very intense instructions to Shlomo about the revenge, vendettas he's supposed to take and deal with all the enemies that he doesn't want to bother Shlomo. And I think it's also an interesting piece because we see that while he was very weak in Parak Aleph, he still has what left in him. So I think that, again, while there definitely are elements that seem overtly contradictory, it's not like the story ends in Parak Aleph. I mean, there's more to David after that. So I think that that's also a relevant piece. Now, we have a lot of other characters, even just in our Haftorah, even just in that first parak. And I think we could talk about all of them in different ways, but maybe for the sake of our conversation today, maybe you want to briefly think about the role of Yoav, who sort of is an interesting and also duplicitous to a certain degree character, again, depending on how we look at the alliances. And so I'm curious what you think about Yoav.
So Yoav to me is a fascinating character. I've actually recently given shir on Yoav at the Hertag Yom Yon. And the problem with Yoav is he seems like he doesn't always listen to everything David tells him to do, but he's pretty loyal to David, meaning he wants what's best for David. So it's very strange that he seems to take Adoniyahu's side here because he's on David's cabinet, and you would have thought he would be loyal to David. But if you look closer at the storyline itself, there's really two different perspectives here of this entire story, which gives you two different perspectives to Yoav. Because you could say that Yoav was actually being incredibly loyal here, meaning if David really never announced to anyone who's supposed to be next in line. So Yoav is looking and saying, who should it be? I can't let David die without there being another king. That would cause chaos to the kingdom. You can't have a kingdom without a king, and no one would know who's supposed to be king. And the brothers will all fight. He's got lots of sons, fight each other. So I need to pick who I think is supposed to be the next king and who I think David might want. And I think that connects back to what you were saying before, that Adoniyahu, there was something strong about him, something that maybe it made sense he was supposed to be king next. And if you look in terms of in Shmuel Bet, also in Divrei Ha-Yamim, when it tells you who were the sons of David. So Amnon is his oldest. He's dead. Kilab or Daniel, depending on in which sefer you're looking, what his name is. The Gemara tells us had no interest in being king. Avshalom is dead. Adoniyahu is son number 4. So he's next in line. So almost you could understand that Yoav is saying, this is the one who I think David would want me to pick. Shlomo is not an obvious choice. His mother is a scandal. He himself is not of the first 6 sons born to David and Hebron. He is number 4 listed as or number 5 if you count the baby who has died of Bathsheba. So that's a question if he was really first of Bathsheba or not. But it's not an obvious choice that Shlomo is supposed to be chosen. And therefore, one perspective is Yoav was thinking, what do I think David would want? And it adds to the picture that David really hasn't told anyone who is supposed to be chosen. The other possibility is that this is Yoav's attempt to grab power. Now that David is going to, be dying, I want to make sure that I stay in control, that I'm still the general. And he picked the son that he thought maybe he could manipulate, or a son that he had an alliance with. And almost there's an irony there, because it's very similar to what his nemesis Avner seems to have done, right? When Avner raises up Ishbosheth, Shaul's son, who he thinks he can manipulate, and really behind the scenes he can control everything. And that's why, he does whatever he does with Ritzpah, the Pelegish of Shaul. And when Ishbosheth figures it out and kind of says, what are you doing? That's when Avner says, well, I'm leaving you because I liked being in control. Maybe there's something going on here with Yoav as well. I'm going to pick the son that I can manipulate. I'm going to pick the son I have an alliance with. And this is my opportunity, since David is in bed and not announcing, for me to choose the son or to help promote the son that I think will, bring about my being able to remain the general and to remain in power. So 2 very different pictures of Yoav, which again all connects to what I'm hoping we will discuss next, which is, was this all David's choice or not? Right?
Yeah, no, we're going to get right into that. But I think also what's coming through so far very much in this conversation is how we really can look at this whole Haftorah in 2 different ways. Like there's some sort of dichotomy going on, both when we compare to Divrei Ha-Yamim, the characters in it itself. Is it supposed to be embarrassing David? It's supposed to be comforting David? It's very, very complex to figure out how to figure out sort of the end of this lifetime. And to be honest, I think it also makes sense because I think that there's a very big complexity about David is a figure, meaning on one hand is, again, David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayam, and there's a very, very, very strong, his figure looms, eternally as a strong figure. On the other hand, many of the stories about David are very, very difficult stories. And I think that, again, a lot of what ends up becoming his greatness is how he deals with those challenges. But I think that there's also something, I would almost say, a little bit fitting about in the fact that the end of these stories were left with a certain complexity, definitely in regard to how to pass over the baton, and also in terms of the legacy of David as it appears here, as it appears in Divrei Ha-Yamim. And I think that that's a piece that comes through in all the breadth of the stories about him. So why don't we jump into that last piece about Bathsheba and really the way that Natan brings Bathsheba into the story.
Right. So the whole way the story takes place of Natan telling Bathsheba, you go in first. This is what you should say, that I'll come in, right? It has this feel of we need to manipulate David. We need to make David do something that he wasn't actually going to do. And it reminds us of another story where Yoav tries to manipulate David to bring Avshalom back into the kingdom. And he calls this woman, this Isha Chachama, this wise woman from Tekoa, who literally makes up a story, or Yoav puts the words in her mouth of a made-up story about her sons in order to manipulate David into allowing Avshalom back. And by putting those two stories together, which are so parallel, you all of a sudden ask the question of, wait, so is what the woman from Tekoa was saying, that one son killed the other son, and could you please help me to stop my relatives from killing my one remaining son, right, was a made-up story. So is this a made-up story too? And that's the question that we have to ask, which is, clearly we want to get David to announce something that he isn't announcing, maybe because he's too old and he forgets, or because he doesn't want to. We're not sure, but they're trying to convince him to do something. So the question is, are we convincing him to do something that really he genuinely said? Because if we look at the language, they're saying, remember, you told Bathsheba that Shlomo is supposed to be king. So is it that that's really true? And the question is, who chose Shlomo? Is it the fact that Natan knows means he's the prophet, right? So he knows as well. When we reflect on Shlomo being born in Shmuel Bet Parak Yud Bet, and we name him Shlomo, it then says, V'Hashem Ohavo, Hashem loved him, and Natan HaNavi comes and renames him Yedidia. Is that the moment where we all know, and it's being declared in that moment, Shlomo's supposed to be king, and therefore this is something that's chosen by God, and therefore, of course, David knows this, and of course, Natan HaNavi knows it, and David's just maybe too older right now, not announcing it, but we're trying to get him to do something that God wanted him to do. Is it something, though, that David maybe had said privately to Bathsheba? If you look closely, Natan says that David nishpata la'amatcha, to you. And when she repeats it, that's what she says. Because maybe when he's trying to convince Bathsheba after, they're mourning their dead baby, and this is brought up by Radak, he says, don't worry, we could be together again, because I promise the next son you have will be king. And therefore, this was a private promise that David made to Bathsheba, which actually fits very nicely into the story, because when Natan enters the room, he doesn't say, don't you remember you told me? He comes into the room and he says, by the way, David, did you know that Adoniyahu said he's going to be king? Is that what you wanted? That's what Natan says. He doesn't say you said or God said Shlomo's supposed to be king. So it makes us wonder, is it David never said it? Or is it David only said it to Bathsheba, and therefore he said it in a moment of passion or a moment of compassion, right, to Bathsheba to calm her down? And therefore we really have three possibilities. One is that it was declared already by God. It was declared by the time when Shlomo was born. Is it that David said this as a private promise to Bathsheba to calm her down, as many of the Mefarshim bring down? Or is it that he never said it at all? And they are manipulating him now into thinking, oh, right, maybe I said that. Maybe that's the right way. And again, I could understand why they would want to do that. Natan as the Navi, and I bring back what we said earlier, maybe wanted the more spiritual type of leader, wanted the correct leader, right, to take over at this point. And Bathsheba, you could understand her perspective as wanting to look out for her son. And this leads to, I would say, the question of how we're supposed to look at Bathsheba, which you brought up earlier. Is she much more of a passive character here that's being manipulated by Natan to fulfill what he thinks is right? Or is this an active Bathsheba who, to some extent, is resembling the Imahot, right? To make sure that her son is the one that gets to be next in line. Her son who's appropriate for the job is the one that's chosen, reminding us of Sara, who says, send out Yishmael to make sure that Yitzchak is chosen. It's two very, very different pictures of Bathsheba, which helps us in the next story of Bathsheba, when Adoniyahu comes and says, could you tell Shlomo that I should, marry Avishag? And again, she's the one that's being told to go speak to the king, because again, is it she's more passive and people can manipulate her to get what they want? Or is it she is the one that everybody listens to? She's the one that David will end up listening to. She's the one that Shlomo will respect enough to give that request the time of day. As if you look at the language there, there, which I want to reflect on to understand Bathsheba. When she comes into the room, the pasuk tells us that Shlomo got up, he put out a throne for her, she sat to his right. The respect that's given to Bathsheba is absolutely amazing. And all of a sudden you take a step back and you realize this story, if we reflect on Bathsheba, resembles that of Esther, right? She starts out as the person who's being taken, the person who is much more passive in the story. They're both described as beautiful, but at the end, they both come to the king. There's a malach. What can I do for you, Esther? What can I do for you, Bathsheba? And in both of these stories, they end up saving us from somebody who should not be in control, right? The Haman or the Adoniyahu, and help the Jewish people and the Jewish people's story. So at the end of the day, I think certainly you can look at Natan being the one behind the scene who's manipulating to make sure the right king gets chosen, and he's the prophet. So that makes sense. You could see Bathsheba as the strong character here, as the mother of Shlomo looking out for her son, or certainly you can put the Divrei Ha-Yamim picture back in, and it's David who always meant to pick Shlomo as the next king, and of course ends up getting up off that bed, as is reflected in Divrei Ha-Yamim, and making sure that Shlomo is chosen. And these are very different ways of looking at our Haftorah.
No, first of all, there's so much we can unpack here, and I encourage all of our listeners to think about these different interpretations over Shabbat, over the coming days. Because I also think if I just look at the storyline of Bathsheba, right? Bathsheba doesn't really speak, right, in the story that we meet her in. And then all of a sudden we see her here in a very different light. And then, as you said, has a continuation in the story as well. And it almost feels like, even if there's an element of her being sort of utilized for the purposes of the power dynamics within the kingship, I do sometimes feel that there's a little bit of I feel happy for her to a certain degree, that she sort of gets some sort of role based, that the beginnings were rough. The beginnings were slightly painful. They're painful for me to read every time anew. But she does come back here. And in the end, when she is the mother of the Melech, and that is what's solidified. And as you said, it turns out well, at least for a while, the story of Shlomo. And I feel like a lot of times it comforts me, not that it matters, but it comforts me when it comes to the storyline of who Bathsheba was. But I think that we've really you have pointed out something really important, which is that it's not always simple to interpret a biblical story. And there are multiple ways of looking at this one. This one, I think, sometimes even more than, last week in our conversation, we didn't focus as much on Elisha. We focused more on the women. But a lot of times, because of the paucity of the material, or because we have material that's reflected differently in different sources, that we're not always sure exactly how to look at it. And especially here, I think also when you look at political maneuverings, or you look at the turning over of power, there often are different ways to look at it. It's not always clear exactly what are the motives of leaders, and it's not necessarily always something that the audience or those of us who are reading it can totally understand. So I think that it's really important that we've highlighted that, the difficulty of being able to interpret in one way. It's not one way. It might even be three ways has been coming out in our conversation. And I think that that's an important piece in and of itself. I guess for me, the last piece that I'm left with in these early prakim, again, in which also David is going to pass away, is this question of, it's a little bit of a painful ending for the David stories. And I think that the ultimate seal of approval that Shlomo was given by God through Natan Navi is something that often also softens that. But I think also the juxtaposition of Melachim to Divrei Ha-Yamim is also an important piece, because again, Divrei Ha-Yamim is going to present him very, very differently. But the trajectory as we have it from Shmuel to Melachim, there's a real harshness to it in the way that David's life unfolds from that moment with Bathsheba. But ultimately, he is able to establish one of his sons, who ends up building the Beit Mikdash and really is successful in that endeavor. He does continue in that regard. So I think we've been thrown into the complexity kind of the David story, mamash at the end pieces there. And I think that this has been really great, and being able to understand that there are multiple ways to look at the story and all of the figures in the story.
May I add one final piece? So
Always.
The Haftorah itself, to me, actually totally reflects the story of Avraham in a very strong way, because to some extent, Bathsheba, who's taken, reflects Sara, who gets taken, as we know, twice within her story. And the entire storyline of Sara is this balance between being passive and being active, and making sure that the son that, again, maybe is more aggressive, and the son that maybe has more leadership, you would think, which is the Ishmael, right, is not the one that's chosen, but rather it's Yitzchak, reflecting on Bathsheba, not Adoniyahu, but rather it's her son, Shlomo, who would not necessarily, you would have thought, should be chosen outright, but ends up, of course, being this incredible spiritual guide for the Jewish people. But you also have the Avraham to the David, both of them who are incredible leaders of Am Yisrael and role models for Am Yisrael. But the end of Avraham's life also, he marries Keturah and has other children. He kind of falls off the map a little bit after the death of Sara, which is reflected in some of the writings of the Rav, where after Sara dies, we kind of see a different version, a weaker version of Avraham. So too, when it comes to David, there seems to be this ending on this more weaker note. But on the other hand, they have both produced something that continues their story, that continues their legacy. And I think it's important for us to realize that our role models in Tanakh, they have their ups and downs too. They reflect humanity. They reflect our lives, which has ups and has downs. And I think that actually ends up being comforting to us, the ambiguities within their stories and the questions in their stories of, did they end on a high? Did they end on a low? It helps us when we have our ups and downs in our lives to see that as long as we continue moving forward, and the goal is, as Avraham spreading Shem Hashem and creating the chosen nation, for David, it was continuing Malchus Yehuda, but also the building of the Beit HaMikdash, having that be the end result, which of course he is able to do, even with maybe some of those ups and downs, can be comforting for us as well.
Dr. Nechama Price, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.